Life can change in the blink of an eye. One moment, David O'Connor was a husband, a father, a firefighter admired by his community. The next, he was standing in the ruins of his family's happiness, his wife gone and his teenage daughter, Emma, drifting further away with every passing day. They were both drowning in their own grief, but instead of coming together, they fell apart. David, brave enough to face the fiercest flames, was lost in the quiet battles of fatherhood. And Emma, angry and hurting, found herself rebelling against the one person who was always there for her. But what happens when the distance between them grows too wide? When the unspoken pain turns into anger, and the love that once bound them feels like it's slipping through their fingers? Is there a way back, or have they already lost each other for good? This is a story of a father who won't give up, and a daughter who's lost in a storm of grief and rebellion. It's about family, heartbreak, and the courage it takes to rebuild what's broken, even when the cracks seem too deep. The blare of sirens pierced the early morning stillness, red and blue lights flashing against the windows of modest homes. David O'Connor gripped the wheel of the fire truck, his focus unshakable. As the truck barreled down the street, people in the neighborhood waved and whispered his name, a firefighter known for his bravery. To them, he was a hero, someone who faced danger head-on to save lives. But inside, David felt like a fraud. No matter how many lives he saved, he couldn't reach the one person who mattered most, his daughter, Emma. At home, he was not a hero. He was just a man who didn't know how to fix the brokenness between them. As he pulled the hose from the truck, the fire blazing in front of him felt like a welcome distraction. The adrenaline masked the ache he felt every time he walked into his empty house, his late wife's absence casting a long shadow over their lives. It had been 2 years since the accident, but the hole she left behind only seemed to grow larger. David had tried to be everything for Emma, both father and mother, but each day he felt her slipping further away. At the firehouse, he was a man of action. At home, he was a man drowning in his own helplessness. He watched the flames curl up toward the sky, knowing that while he could control this blaze, the fire burning between him and Emma was a different beast altogether. Their once cozy home, now cold and quiet, felt less like a place of refuge and more like a battlefield. She hardly spoke to him anymore, only throwing bitter words his way when forced. It was like the more David tried to hold on to her, the further she pulled away. He knew she was hurting, but he didn't know how to reach her. How could a man who ran into burning buildings feel so powerless in his own house? The fire was out now, and his team was packing up the equipment. David's mind wandered back to Emma, probably sitting in her room, locked behind that door like she'd locked him out of her world. His fellow firefighters slapped him on the back, joking about grabbing a beer later, but David could only manage a weak smile. He didn't want to go home to the silence, to the reminders of his failure as a father. Emma's teenage rebellion was her way of grieving, he knew that much. But knowing didn't make it easier. The distance between them felt like an endless road with no signs of turning back. As David climbed back into the truck, the familiar sounds of the engine roaring to life filled his ears. But his mind was somewhere else, thinking about the nights he used to spend sitting on the porch with Emma, back when things were simple, before the weight of life had crushed them. He had wealth in terms of respect in the community, but what did it matter when the person he loved most didn't see him anymore? In the rearview mirror, David caught a glimpse of himself, tired, worn, and barely holding it together. But tomorrow was another day. Another chance to try. Another hope that somehow, things would get better. As the fire truck pulled away, the streets grew quiet again, save for the wind brushing against the windows of houses. The O'Connor home was just another stop on this street, but inside, it was a battlefield of emotions, misunderstandings, and a daughter who had built walls so high, David wasn't sure he could climb them. He was a man who could face fire, but fatherhood, especially after loss, was proving to be a fire of its own, a slow, smoldering one that might burn out everything if he didn't find a way to save it. Emma O'Connor wasn't just any rebellious teenager, she was a girl whose world had been ripped apart too soon. Her anger wasn't just about the typical teenage stuff, rules, curfews, and grades, it was deeper. Losing her mother had left a hole in her heart that no amount of yelling or ignoring her father could fill. She walked through life with headphones in, blocking out the world, especially David, who she felt didn't understand her grief. Her grades were slipping, she skipped classes, and the group of friends she chose seemed determined to push every limit. To anyone else, she was just acting out, but to Emma, it was survival. At school, she was the girl who sat in the back, eyes cast down, pretending to care about the lessons while her mind wandered elsewhere. Teachers called David about her poor performance, but Emma barely listened when he tried to talk to her. The distance between them grew with every ignored conversation, every slammed door. David didn't get it, he was a firefighter, a hero to everyone else, but he couldn't save her. The house felt more like a prison, and Emma wanted out. She wasn't sure where she was going, but anywhere had to be better than facing the suffocating grief she couldn't escape at home. Her rebellion wasn't about her father, it wasn't even about her. It was about the overwhelming sadness she didn't know how to express. She missed her mother, but she didn't know how to say it. How do you tell the one person who's trying their best that their best just isn't enough? Emma didn't hate David, though sometimes it felt easier to pretend she did. It was less painful than admitting that seeing him every day only reminded her of what they had lost. She felt trapped, stuck between a life that was over and a future she couldn't imagine. David tried, but Emma wasn't ready to see that yet. Every time he reached out, she pulled away harder, pushing the limits at school, breaking curfew, hanging out with kids she knew he wouldn't approve of. She wanted to feel something, anything, besides the pain. Every argument, every tear-streaked shouting match only pushed them further apart. And yet, behind her anger was a girl desperately seeking a way to navigate a world without her mother in it. Her rebellion was her way of screaming into the void, hoping someone, maybe even David, would hear her. It wasn't just about breaking the rules. Emma was testing the boundaries of her own heart, trying to figure out where her life started and where her grief ended. The nights out with friends, the poor choices, they were distractions from the emptiness she felt inside. She wanted to believe that if she rebelled hard enough, maybe she'd forget. But every time she came home, the familiar creak of the door and the stillness of the house reminded her that her mother wasn't coming back, and that nothing she did could change that. The distance between her and David was growing more each day, and with it, a heavy silence settled in their home. She wanted to hate him for not being able to fix things, but deep down, she knew it wasn't his fault. They were both hurting, both lost in their own grief. But for Emma, anger was easier than sadness. Rebellion was easier than feeling vulnerable. If she could just keep pushing, maybe the pain would stop. Or maybe, she feared, it never would. David wasn't blind to the fact that Emma was slipping away. He saw it in the way she avoided his eyes, how she rushed to her room the minute she walked through the door. But he wasn't giving up, not yet. He tried, clumsily, to reconnect with her in the only ways he knew how. One evening, he cooked her favorite meal, spaghetti, with the sauce recipe passed down from her mother. The aroma filled the small kitchen, and for a moment, he thought maybe this time would be different. Emma came downstairs, glanced at the food, and with barely a word, took her plate up to her room. His heart sank as the sound of her door shutting echoed through the house. There were other attempts too, all well-meaning but painfully unsuccessful. He showed up to one of her school events, awkwardly standing in the back of the auditorium, hoping his presence would mean something. But Emma barely acknowledged him, her friends whispering and giggling about the fireman dad, who didn't fit in with the scene. The gap between them felt more like a canyon, growing wider with every missed moment. He tried to ask her about her day, to find even a sliver of connection, but she would shrug and offer nothing more than a cold, fine. In those quiet moments, David would retreat to the firehouse, his sanctuary. There, with his fellow firefighters, he felt strong, capable. But even his colleagues noticed the weariness in his eyes, the way he would fall silent in conversations about family. They'd rib him gently, offering advice about teenage daughters, but nothing seemed to stick. One day, his captain handed him an old fireman's helmet, a gift from when he'd first joined the squad. "For your girl," he said, "maybe it'll remind her what you do, what you're fighting for." David took the helmet, unsure if it would make a difference, but desperate enough to try. At home, the helmet sat untouched on the kitchen counter for days. Every time he thought about giving it to Emma, something stopped him. It wasn't just a helmet, it was a symbol of who he was, a protector, but he feared it wasn't enough. He feared she would look at it the same way she looked at him now, like a stranger trying too hard to be relevant in a life that no longer had space for him. Still, David kept hoping that maybe one day she would see him as more than just the man who couldn't save her from her pain. The house itself was filled with these failed attempts at connection. Emma's room, once bright with posters and laughter, now felt like a fortress. David would pass by her door, hoping to hear music or the sound of her voice, anything that meant she was still his little girl. He found himself lingering near her mother's old belongings, a photo album left on the shelf, a scarf still hanging in the closet. Sometimes, he would take out the old family photo, where they all looked so happy, and wonder where it had all gone wrong. But despite all the failures, David wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. The same way he faced a roaring fire, knowing the risks, knowing the danger, he faced the silence between him and Emma with the same determination. He would keep trying, keep reaching out, even if it meant getting burned. The helmet still sat on the counter, waiting. He hoped one day, it would be more than just a piece of his past. Maybe it could be the bridge they both needed to start building a future again. The tension between Emma and David had been simmering for months, but the night it all boiled over came like a storm no one saw coming. Emma had been invited to a party, one of those wild, unsupervised gatherings that her new friends were all too familiar with. David had sensed something off when she left the house that evening, but he was on call and didn't have the energy for another argument. "Don't stay out too late," he had said, though the words felt empty as they left his mouth. Emma barely nodded, slipping out the door into the night, leaving behind the same cold silence that had become all too familiar. The party spiraled out of control faster than anyone could have imagined. What started as loud music and harmless fun turned into something darker, a dangerous mix of alcohol, bad decisions, and an accidental fire. Emma found herself trapped, the flames licking the walls of the old house as chaos erupted around her. In that moment, all the rebellion and anger melted away, replaced by raw fear. She was cornered, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to do. Her friends had scattered, the smoke thickening with each passing second. All she could think was, "I need my dad." Meanwhile, David had been at the station when the call came in, a fire on the other side of town, reports of kids trapped inside. His gut clenched as he listened to the address, a knot of fear forming in his chest. He knew Emma had gone to a party, but he didn't know where. Still, something inside him screamed that this was it. This was her. Without hesitation, he jumped into the truck, his mind racing faster than the wheels beneath him. This wasn't just another call, this was his daughter, and he wasn't about to lose her too. When he arrived on the scene, the flames were already out of control. His team rushed to contain the blaze, but David's eyes scanned the crowd for any sign of Emma. Panic set in when he didn't see her, and without thinking, he charged into the building, the heat instantly overwhelming. His training kicked in, each step calculated, but his heart was pounding in his ears. Somewhere in that inferno was his little girl. The smoke was suffocating, the flames roaring louder, but David pushed forward, calling out her name with every ounce of strength he had left. And then he saw her, Emma, huddled in a corner, coughing, her face streaked with tears and ash. In that split second, nothing else mattered. Not the months of rebellion, not the anger, not the distance between them. All David saw was his daughter, and he knew he'd walk through fire again and again to save her. He reached her in time, pulling her into his arms and carrying her out of the burning house. The outside world came rushing back as they emerged, the cool air a stark contrast to the blazing heat they had just escaped. For Emma, the moment was surreal. As David held her, she realized that he wasn't just the man who had been trying and failing to connect with her, he was her father, the one person who would risk everything for her. The walls she had built around herself started to crack, the weight of her rebellion suddenly feeling small in comparison to the overwhelming relief of being safe in his arms. As the fire raged behind them, Emma clung to David, the first step toward understanding just how much he had always cared, even when she hadn't been able to see it. In the aftermath of the fire, the world seemed to slow down. Emma sat on the edge of a hospital bed, wrapped in a blanket, her mind reeling from everything that had just happened. Her hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. She couldn't shake the image of her father bursting through the flames, his face determined, risking his own life without hesitation. As she looked around the sterile hospital room, the reality of it all began to sink in. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel angry, she felt grateful. Grateful that her father had been there, just like he always was. David sat beside her, silent for a long while. The air between them was heavy with unsaid words. He wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words got caught in his throat. Instead, he just looked at her, his eyes filled with both relief and exhaustion. After everything they'd been through, after all the nights of arguing in silence, there was a shift now. Something had changed. Emma wasn't pushing him away anymore. For once, the walls were down. She looked up at him, her eyes soft with an emotion he hadn't seen in so long, vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Dad," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of all the pain and distance between them. David felt his chest tighten. He hadn't heard those words from her in what seemed like a lifetime. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to be sorry, Em," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want you to be okay." It wasn't about the rebellion, or the fights, or the fire. It was about healing, about finding their way back to each other. And in that moment, they both knew they were ready to try. Emma looked down at their hands, her thumb tracing over the rough skin of his fingers, the hands that had saved so many lives, including hers. "I didn't mean to make it so hard," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. I didn't know how to deal with everything. With Mom." The grief that had been a silent shadow in both their lives was now out in the open. David nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "I know. I miss her too. Every single day." It was the first time they had spoken about her mother like this, without the barriers of anger and frustration. Just raw, aching honesty. In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the echoes of the past, they began to heal. Emma's rebellious streak had been her way of crying out for help, and David's silence had been his way of holding it all in. But now, they were both finally ready to let go of the hurt and start rebuilding. David reached into his jacket and pulled out the fireman's helmet his captain had given him. "I've been holding on to this," he said, offering it to her. "I thought maybe it could remind you of. I don't know, that I'll always be here. No matter what." Emma took the helmet, her fingers brushing over the worn surface. It wasn't just a symbol of his job, it was a symbol of his love, his commitment to her, even when she hadn't wanted to see it. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in a long while, David felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The bond they had thought was lost was still there, fragile but strong enough to be rebuilt. And as they sat together, hand in hand, they both knew this was the beginning of something new. The days following the fire felt like a fresh start for David and Emma, even though their lives hadn't magically transformed overnight. They still had a long road ahead, but now they were walking it together. Emma began to open up more, and David, in turn, learned to listen without trying to fix everything right away. Their conversations, once stilted and tense, became moments of real connection, moments where they could share both the weight of their grief and the hope they were beginning to feel. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. David returned to work with a new sense of purpose. The respect and admiration he received from his colleagues for his heroism that night meant more to him now than it ever had, but not for the reasons it used to. Emma had been there, standing in the crowd as the town honored him for his bravery, and this time, her eyes weren't distant or filled with resentment. She was proud of him, not just as a firefighter, but as her father, a man who had fought not only fires but for their relationship as well. He caught her gaze during the ceremony, and the small smile she gave him was all the reward he needed. At home, the atmosphere had shifted. The house no longer felt like a battlefield, but more like a place where healing could happen. Emma started spending less time locked away in her room and more time with her dad. They watched movies together, shared meals again, and sometimes, without even realizing it, they laughed. The pain of losing her mother hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt like the weight that would drown them both. They were learning how to carry it together, and in that, they found strength. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Emma turned to David, her voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking," she said, "maybe I could help out at the firehouse. Not, like, fight fires or anything, but maybe just, be around. It feels like a part of you I didn't really understand before." David's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and emotion. The fact that she wanted to be a part of his world, after so many months of pushing him away, felt like a victory greater than any award or recognition. "I'd like that," he replied, his voice thick with gratitude. "I'd like that a lot." As the weeks passed, they built new routines, ones that respected both the past and the future they were creating together. David still missed his wife deeply, and Emma still had moments where the loss felt overwhelming. But they had each other now, and that made all the difference. Their bond was no longer frayed and fragile, it had been forged in the fire of their shared grief, tempered by love and understanding. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were rebuilding, brick by brick, day by day. The final scene played out at another firehouse ceremony, but this time, it wasn't about David's heroism. It was a community gathering, a moment to celebrate resilience, and Emma stood beside her father, her head held high. The people of their town had seen David as a hero for years, but now Emma saw it too, not just in the way he ran into burning buildings, but in the way he had fought for her, for them. As the event drew to a close, she wrapped her arm around his, leaning into him as they watched the crowd disperse. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, a new beginning, built on the ashes of what they had lost and the hope of what was still to come. What would you do if the person you loved the most started slipping away, and no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't reach them? David O'Connor faced that every single day. His story, one of courage, heartbreak, and the relentless fight for family, isn't just about the battles he fought at work. It's about the silent war at home, the one with no sirens, no flashing lights, just a father and daughter struggling to find their way back to each other. Have you ever felt like you're losing someone you love, even though they're right in front of you? What would you do to save that bond before it's too late? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this, a story that speaks to the heart, to the challenges of family, and to the resilience it takes to overcome even the deepest pain.